Good afternoon, everyone. This is Greg Core at the Office of Special Education Programs. Thanks for joining us today. We're coming down the home stretch for federal fiscal year 2024. As such, this will be our last monthly call of the fiscal year. Today's call will cover some important information and updates in the fiscal world. Matt Schneer, who leads, among other things, our fiscal implementation team, will cover several topics, including information on uniform guidance revisions, changes in prior approval requirements, dates of implementation, and other relevant information. In addition, we're going to provide some clarification on expectations for fiscal monitoring for both Part B and Part C. That relates directly to OSEP Memo 2301. We will be taking a break in October, so our next monthly TA call will be on November 14th when we focus on family engagement. Details on that call will be sent out as we get closer to that date. An important note, the OSEP ideasthatwork.org website will close on September 20th. AIR has been hosting that website for us. We want to express our appreciation to AIR and particularly to Shoshana Romanovsky, who's been hosting our monthly TA calls. They've given us extraordinary support over the past several years. Information on OSEP monthly TA calls will be available on the IDEA website moving forward. So we will continue to notify you and other members of our field about this change. So please reference the playlist for past recordings or contact your OSEP state lead for more information. So with that, I will then turn our call over to Matt Schneer.
Thank you, Greg, and good afternoon, everybody. Want to apologize in advance. You're going to have to listen to me for the remainder of today's call. We're not going to have any other voices, and we'll be covering fiscal topics, as Greg mentioned, and I know that's not everybody's cup of tea, but it is important information that we really do want to take a little time to highlight as we move forward. Today's call will focus on, as Greg mentioned, a variety of fiscal updates, including highlights in the uniform guidance revisions to EDGAR as well, the Education Department administrative regulations, revised guidance on the use of federal funds for food, conferences, and meetings. And we will start today by talking about a discussion of fiscal monitoring and our expectations for states. Next slide, please. So I know all of you are familiar with OSEP Memo 2301. And as noted in that first bullet, one of the things that we clarified is that we do expect that states monitor all of their LEAs or EIS programs and providers within a reasonable period of time and at least once within a 6-year period, which is based on the duration of the SPP APR. We have been asked over the last several months whether this expectation, in addition to programmatic monitoring, applies to fiscal monitoring. So I want to address that question. And the short answer is that this requirement does not explicitly apply to fiscal monitoring. And the reason for that is that the link to the justification for the 6-year cycle that we mentioned in question A11 of OSEP Memo 2301 was linked specifically to the lifespan of the SPP APR, 6 years. Because the SPP APR does not include fiscal indicators and there are no related requirements to fiscal issues, there is no justification for saying that you must do your fiscal monitoring within 6 years, as it does not appear in any of the statutes or cross-cutting um, fiscal regulations. However, there is an expectation that monitoring will occur within a reasonable period of time. And that reasonable period of time is something that states can determine based on a number of factors, and they should be prepared to justify in any discussions with OSEP monitors or auditors, et cetera. Let's move on to the next slide, please. So we all know that fiscal monitoring plays a key role in ensuring that IDA funds are spent for allowable costs and to serve the purposes of improving results and outcomes for the kids we all serve, infants, toddlers, and children and youth with disabilities. We know that there is a general expectation that all Part B and C programs conduct fiscal monitoring in order to ensure that funds are used for allowable purposes and are used to improve outcomes, and that these expectations are reflected in both IDA and uniform guidance requirements. We're going to, for the next few minutes, explore a little bit more about those expectations. Next slide, please. So our expectation is that fiscal monitoring for IDA programs will include monitoring for both compliance with both cross-cutting fiscal requirements in the uniform guidance and EDGAR and other federal regulations, as well as specific IDA requirements. So examples of uniform guidance requirements include procurement, internal control, time and effort, and inventory, and other such requirements. Under IDA for Part B, we have things like LEAMOE, excess cost, proportionate share. For Part C, payer of last resort, systems of payments, and consent for insurance requirements. So again, we would expect that a comprehensive fiscal monitoring system would be able to cover all of these areas, whether it's done through one process or multiple processes. Obviously, we don't expect you to monitor for every single requirement under IDA, just as we say that under programmatic, but we do expect you to make a reasonable effort to monitor for key requirements throughout. The fiscal monitoring system should be reasonably designed. As I said, it should be within a reasonable period of time covering all of your local programs. And it can be cyclical, it can be risk-based, or some combination of those. Specific decisions on the frequency and scope of the monitoring, there is flexibility for states to determine, decide, but you should be considering risk factors among other past performance and other factors. In addition, we do expect you to establish and maintain effective internal controls, both at the state level and the local level. Next slide, please. So, subrecipient monitoring. For all SEAs and any Part C lead agencies that have subrecipients, fiscal monitoring of IDA funds is part of the subrecipient monitoring requirements described in OMB uniform guidance. So the expectation for subrecipient monitoring applies to all SEAs and to any Part C lead agencies that are subgranting. These expectations include conducting a risk assessment and considering that risk assessment in your fiscal monitoring, issuing grant award notices or GANs, having an application process, and conducting monitoring in accordance with the requirements laid out in 200.332 in the uniform guidance. Next slide, please. So a few years ago in the Appropriations Act of 2021, for the first time, we laid out the option for Part C programs to subgrant as an option, not as a requirement, as it is under Part Part B, where it's laid out in the regulations. And OSEP recently, in the most recent application, has asked states to indicate in their grant application whether or not they are subgranting. It is up to states to determine whether they are subgranting or using contracting for sending the IDA funds out. But they should do this carefully and make a careful determination of this. Next slide, please. When making this determination, lead agencies should, as I said, make careful considerations and determinations, because there are a lot of implications of deciding to do subgrants, including such things as needing, as I said, to run an application process, issue GANs. There's also an impact on indirect costs, the requirement to conduct risk assessments, and conduct subrecipient monitoring in accordance with the rules in the Uniform Guidance 200.332. And we really recommend that states take their time to look through the requirements and what they're doing to determine if it makes sense to say that they are subgranting and whether they are all of those requirements or not. OSEP, as well as the Center for IDA Fiscal Reporting, are available for technical assistance on this, and we'll be providing more information on this issue. It has come up in a number of our monitoring visits with Part C programs, as we've had to talk through the implications of that, and it affects how we monitor you in the DMS process and what our expectations are. So this is an important decision that you should take seriously. Next slide, please. Currently, most Part C programs do not subgrant, but as I indicated earlier, of course, you're still responsible for monitoring each program, function, or activity under Uniform Guidance 200.329. You also have to maintain oversight to ensure that contractors perform in accordance with the contracts or purchase orders. And fiscal monitoring is a specific responsibility under the single line of responsibility. In addition, as I mentioned before, you continue to be responsible for maintaining internal controls and making sure that your local programs are doing so as well. So that's some highlights around our expectations for fiscal monitoring. We have a lot of detailed discussions through our DMS reports. For additional information, you might want to take a look at some of the reports that we've issued where we've made findings around fiscal monitoring, whether in terms of both Part B and Part C programs not meeting those expectations. That will give you some information. And if you want to have additional conversations with OSEP, feel free to reach out through your state leads. We'll bring in members of the fiscal team to have additional discussions with you. With that, we're going to move on to our next topic, and we'll go to the next slide, please. As has been mentioned, as you know, the OMB Uniform Guidance has been revised. The final revisions were published in the Federal Register back in April. It is officially effective on October 1st of 2024, when the new federal fiscal year begins. However, as has been communicated to you earlier, there is flexibility for formula grants like IDA to make some of the provisions of the revised uniform guidance effective July 1st, 2024. And that's been laid out in some of the information around grants, and we'll talk about it a little bit more. In addition, the revisions apply to all active grants, including the grants that have carryover from FFYs 2022 and 2023. Over the next several minutes, I will go over some of the highlights of the changes in the uniform guidance. This is by no means a comprehensive review of all the changes and revisions in the uniform guidance. I'm just trying to highlight some of those things that I think are most important for formula grants in IDA. The department has issued frequently asked questions linked here on the slide that goes through in more detail some of these changes. So I recommend taking a look at those and referring any of your fiscal staff that are not on today's call to those frequently asked questions. Next slide, please. So some of the changes that have already been highlighted before we issued our grants, one of the specific changes is that no longer need prior approval from us for either participant support costs. And when we talk about participant support costs, we mean when non-state staff attend conferences and travel costs related to that. Previously, there were requirements for participant support costs, although we modified those over the last few years. In addition, prior approval is not required for rent, but it should be noted in terms of rent that using IDA funds for rent should only be done with caution, as it may raise issues of supplement not supplant. If you're trying to cover costs of rent for buildings, that is not normally something that we would see under IDA, particularly if it's involving the use of property that is for more than just IDA purposes. I would recommend that if you're doing that, that's something that you consult with your IDA, your OSEP state lead moving forward. As I mentioned, in addition, while prior approval is still required for equipment, the threshold for what is considered equipment and therefore needs prior approval has been raised. It officially, as it's said on the slide, is from the lesser of the state capitalization level for the financial statement purposes, or $5,000, to the lesser of the state capitalization level for financial statement purposes, or $10,000. So effectively, it is raising it from $5,000 to $10,000. I will be honest in saying that before this revision came out, I was not aware of the fact that there was something called a state capitalization level. This is something that all states set for accounting purposes. And so if you want to take advantage of the threshold raising from $5,000 to $10,000, you need to make sure with your financial people that the capitalization level in your state has also been raised to $10,000. If it is less, or if it still is $5,000, that will remain the threshold from there. This information was provided in the TA call in June prior to us issuing the grant letters, and was also included in your grant letter information, so you can refer to that as well. Next slide, please. There are still, as we mentioned, some prior approval that is required for selected costs. In addition, we have equipment, also the revision of your budget, if it is over 10%, still needs prior approval, as well as construction costs. So remember to contact OSEP if you need more information about obtaining prior approval for those types of expenditures. Also note that for those of you who have subrecipients, both in Part B and Part C, you as the grantee or the recipient are responsible for prior approval of these same costs for any of your subrecipients. You want to make sure you have a process for that. Next slide, please. In addition, the audit threshold has been raised from $750,000 to $1 million. So what that means is that only programs that have expenditures or receive funds of up $1 million are subject to a single audit. But it's important to note that states are still responsible for fiscal monitoring of subrecipients even those that are not subject to single audits. And if the subrecipient is not subject to a single audit, that responsibility becomes ever that much more important, as there isn't that additional protection. But I will note, just to make sure, even if your subrecipients are not subject to single audits, you also still are responsible for fiscal monitoring. So single audits in and of themselves, we have said consistently throughout, are not sufficient to meet the requirements for fiscal monitoring. Another change in the uniform guidance is some change in terminology. There were a number of places where some terminology changed, but I wanted to highlight this particular one, where in the past the uniform guidance referred to non-federal agencies when it was talking about states and local programs. It now refers to recipient and subrecipient. It doesn't substantively change anything, but it does help to clarify or bring attention to the fact that many of these requirements not only apply at the state level, but also at the local level, subrecipients as well as recipients, grantees as well, subgrantees as well as grantees. Also note that under 203.29, it emphasizes the fact that the recipient and subrecipient are responsible for the oversight of the federal award. So oversight responsibilities are not only at the state level, but at the local level, to make sure all of the requirements are being met and that they're meeting performance expectations as well. Next slide, please. In addition, under 203.3.1, there is a reinforcement of OSEP as the agency sending out the funds to monitor the states in their oversight of local programs. So that is why we conduct monitoring of how you monitor your local programs. And it just notes that the federal agency although the federal agency does not have a direct legal relationship with recipients or contracts of any tier, the federal agency is responsible for monitoring the pass-through entities, meaning the states, oversight of their first tier recipients. So that is something that we're responsible for, and we're going to continue doing through the DMS responsibility. In addition, again, just re-emphasizing everything that we've been talking about, 200.332 highlights the responsibility of states to ensure that subrecipients that are eligible for federal funds are meeting requirements. They must verify that and specifically that they have to verify that the subrecipient is not excluded or disqualified in accordance with section 180.300, which essentially means that they have not been suspended or debarred. That is nothing new, but it is a highlight of that in 200.332. Next slide, please. So again, that is just a quick summary of some of the most relevant revisions within the uniform guidance that I've gone over. I do recommend, as I said before, that you look at our FAQs if you have not done so. And there are some additional resources that are referenced at the end of this presentation. For the next few minutes, we're going to talk about revisions to EDGAR, or the Education Department General Administration Regulations. As a reminder, EDGAR, we've had EDGAR for a long time. Parts of EDGAR were subsumed in the uniform guidance when it first came out back in, I think, 2014, but there are still independent aspects of EDGAR that remain relevant. So the revisions to EDGAR were recently published on August 29th, and they become effective at the end of this month on September 29th. The most relevant part of EDGAR is in Part 76 for state recipients of formula grants. Apologies for the little typo there. It should say formula, not formular. That part refers to state administered formula grant, which is what IDA is. Next slide, please. So again, I'm just going to go through some of the most salient revisions to Edgar for your consideration. One thing that is interesting, that is relevant to the ability of Part C programs now to subgrant, is that previously Edgar had said that subgranting was not allowed unless the statute in consideration specifically said it was allowed. That was why subgranting was not allowed for Part C until there were changes made to the 2021 Appropriations Act, which specifically said that Part C programs could subgrant. What's interesting now is that the Edgar language has now been reversed to say that subgrants are now are allowed unless specifically prohibited by law, regulation, or the terms and conditions of the grant award. So this will move on. This will remain true for Part C programs. They will be allowed regardless of whether the language remains in the Appropriations Act, as long as Edgar stays the same from that. Again, as we've discussed previously, Part C program states should be careful in making determinations that they are subgrants and pay careful attention to the requirements under 200.332. Just remember what I discussed previously. In addition, Edgar again emphasizes that grantees are responsible for monitoring all subgrants. All right, next slide, please. Again, this is very similar to what I just said. The applicable statutes and regulations to determine who are eligible subgrantees, and a state has the responsibility and the authority to determine if determine subgrantee eligibility if the underlying statutes or regulations do not. And of course, again, grantees are responsible for monitoring subgrants. Next slide, please. Edgar also, there are some revisions under Edgar to a provision that is probably not that well known, but under 76.401, there has always been a ability of a LEA to request a hearing if the SEA takes final action by disproving or failing to approve an application for a subgrant in whole or in part. This really effectively means that it has to have a hearing, the opportunity to have a hearing to appeal not only the disapproval of a grant application, but any withholding of funds. This is also a requirement under IDA. But in addition, under the same provision in Edgar, there is a provision that allows LEAs to appeal the decision of an SEA in such a hearing if the SEA does not rescind their original action to begin with. So an LEA may actually appeal to the Secretary of Education. It is notable that this provision only applies to state education agencies, not to Part C agencies that are not also state education agencies. In the revisions to Edgar, all of this remains the same, except there is a clarification that says that any notices of appeal from an LEA must specifically cite the federal statute, rule, regulation, or guideline that the appellant believes that the SEA's final decision violates, and provide a brief description of the alleged violation. So that would need to be in the appeal to both the SEA and, if relevant, to the Secretary of Education. Next slide, please. That is the last slide on Edgar. Again, the revisions are available and they're linked at the end of this presentation if you're interested in looking at it from there. Finally, I also wanted to highlight some revisions to some guidance that Department of Education had issued a number of years ago on the use of federal funds for food, conferences, and meetings. This has just been recently reissued in August of 2024, linked here on this slide. And I just want to note that as with the original guidance, this new guidance FAQ does not have the force and effect of law, not meant to bind the public. It is intended to provide clarity and some suggestions and considerations about how federal funds can be used in these determinations. Next slide, please. In sum, and I'll talk about this in more detail, what I would say about the revisions to this guidance is that while it still sets a high bar for the use of federal funds to provide for food and some other costs of meetings and conferences, it provides greater responsibility to states to determine whether it is allowable and provides some examples of situations where it might be available, providing perhaps a little bit more flexibility for states to make that determination. In general, just as always, for all grant expenditures, any expenditures must be considered reasonable, necessary, and allocable to the grant in order for them to be allowable. And specifically, the grantee must be able to substantiate with specificity why paying for food and beverages with department funds is necessary to meet the goals and objectives of the grant. We also recommend that before using federal funds for this purpose, look to restructure the agenda so there is time for participants in the meetings or conference to either bring or purchase their own food, beverages, and snacks. Next slide, please. But as I said, it is the responsibility of the state to determine the reasonableness on a case-by-case basis of using food for these purposes. And this guidance provides some examples of situations that might, and I emphasize might, based on a case-by-case determination, it might be reasonable to use ed funds for food. So you'll see here, of particular note is food costs as a family engagement event that could be used as incentive for family to attend, particularly when they're taking time out of their busy schedules. Food costs for a working lunch at a day-long meeting, which was one of the things that was cited in the prior guidance. But in addition, light refreshments at a series of regular after-hour meetings might be reasonable. Or cost of light snacks at a day-long meeting. Some people have speculated whether OSEP's own conferences might be able to provide coffee as in the past. I have no opinion on this, whether that will happen, but you never know. So those are the kinds of things that you could think about on a case-by-case basis to see whether it is reasonable to use federal funds for this purpose. Next slide, please. However, we know there are some specific situations in which it would be not reasonable to utilize federal funds for food costs. So food costs at a networking session, food costs at regular staff meetings, remote meetings, virtual meetings. Anytime that it is part of entertainment as opposed to working sessions would not be reasonable. And of course, it's never reasonable to use federal funds for alcohol. Next slide, please. The guidance goes on to provide some additional considerations, as we keep on emphasizing in all cases, consider whether the costs are reasonable, necessary, and allocable. The guidance also addresses use of federal funds for hosting a meeting or conference. In order to use federal funds for this, need to make sure that it is generally allowable to use funds for this purpose, as long as it is consistent with the approved application or grant by which you got the federal funds, and it is directly relevant to the program and the operation of the grant, and it is necessary and reasonable to achieve the goals and objectives of the approved grant. These are all fairly common sense considerations, but it is useful to have this in our guidance. So with that, that is the end of my discussion of some of the recent fiscal updates. The next few slides will highlight some of the important resources that I have mentioned: OSEP Memo 2301, the Federal Register notice for the uniform guidance, the uniform guidance FAQs that I mentioned. There also is a helpful document available, a red line document of the uniform guidance that actually shows you where the changes are. The Federal Register notice as well for the Edgar notification. Currently do not have any equivalent documents of FAQs or red line. I'm not sure if those are going to come out, but we do have this link there. Next slide, please. We also have the link to the guidance I was just talking about the use of federal funds for food conferences and meetings. In addition, I will note that our fiscal TA center cipher has a document that is helpful for Part C programs considering subgrant, the state considerations for IDA Part C subgranting. So you can take a look at that. Next slide, please. Finally, I wanted to note that this slide lists all of the members of our fiscal team for each of our homeroom teams. And please feel free to contact them directly if you have any follow-up questions regarding any of this, as well as any other additional fiscal requirements, or if you want to reach out to me directly, feel free to do that. So with that, I thank you for your time, and I will open it up for any questions. I haven't had a chance to check. Let me see. It looks like
Matt, there are a few questions.
Yep.
You're game for answering some off the top of your head. If not, we can follow up. But the first one I see, Lauren Thompson has asked us to provide a list of details that would be included in a state's prior approval request, specifically for equipment over $10,000.
Sure, I can give you a few of the things that are required for that. We do have a guidance document out there, and I didn't link it here, but we can follow up with it, that talks about what our expectations are for this. But certainly we would want to know, how the equipment will serve the purposes of IDA, either Part C or Part B. We would want to know what the costs are. We would want quotes that you receive for it. There are some assurances about meeting other federal requirements, such as Buy America, other things along those lines. Let me see if I can think off the top of my head if there's anything anything else that I can think of off the top of my head about that. We'll make sure that you get the full guidance for that, but those are the types of things that we will generally do there. So I see that Kat has asked, is there a discussion of holding in reach around use of funds for food soon? As we increase community partnerships, this is an even more important discussion in our work. Well, the guidance does not specifically address in reach around holding in reach. Does not specifically address community partnerships. I'm not sure I know exactly what you're referring to, Kat. Maybe you can add to that, and I can see if I can add to it. But in general, I think the items that I discussed around family engagement, after work after hours meetings, all day meetings might be able to apply to those circumstances. This guidance comes out of the department as a whole, so I am not aware of any other specific efforts. Okay, there is a follow-up question from Kat about submitting a GEPA. Not sure if that is the requirement under GEPA to issue an equity statement.
Mm.
Subgrantees must do that. That is correct, if that's what you're referring to. So the resource links are in the PowerPoint. Not sure if they've all been put in the chat or not, but they should be available to you. And these slides will be made available to everybody in the near future. There is let me see, there's a request to go back to the fit slide, fit team slide. We'll do that when I finish going through these, see if there are any other questions. So in regards to using federal funds to pay for food, would a quarterly advisory panel count as family engagement? I think, again, that is something that could be reasonably decided on a case-by-case basis. It would be something that we would ask the state to include. But given that in our APR, we talk about the advisory panels as part of the family engagement, and there is a requirement for parent participation in that, I think that is something that could be considered. And then it looks like the next question is about the frequency. There is no specific frequency that we are saying needs to be had. I think that as a default, you could use a 6-year cycle as being reasonable. As we said, that is reasonable for program purposes, but it is up to the state to determine what is reasonable, be able to decide that. Okay, so Kat has followed up. I was thinking about subgrantees being able to use funds for food with community partners and events that they host for grant work with family and communities where food is central to gathering together. I do think what you said covers this. Yes, I would agree. And again, I'm not saying that in all cases it would be allowable. It's a decision for the state to make, but that is an example of something that could be considered to be reasonable. Okay, could we go back to the second to last slide then? This lists the next slide, please, with the members of the fiscal implementation team. Here we go. So again, this lists all of the fiscal team members. Each of our homeroom teams is supposed to have both a fiscal accountability facilitator and audit facilitator. You'll note that one of our teams, Team B, is currently missing a fiscal accountability facilitator. We're hoping we'll be able to hire somebody in the next fiscal year, but we'll see about that. The other teams all have both members, while each of them have some specific responsibilities. They're both available for fiscal TA, and you should feel free to reach out to them, as well as myself, who oversees this fiscal team. And I think that's it, unless I missed anything. Okay.
I think that's all I saw too, Matt.
Okay, great. Well, I
No.
thank you all for hanging in with me, for going through this quick review of some of our fiscal updates. As mentioned, this will be made available to you. And remind me, I know that with the website coming down on the 20th, we will be, I believe, posting this on the IDA, the OSEP IDA website under grantee resources. And so, yes, and Shoshana, thank you. The recording of the webinar as well will be available at that site that is listed there. So that you'll be able to get the resources from there in case you have any questions. So thank you so much. Greg, are there any final words, or should we let everybody go?
Well, thank you, Matt, for walking us through these and making them as understandable as possible. Also want to thank our listeners for tuning in this afternoon. We had a pretty good crowd, like 250 people. And then last but not least, again, I want to express my appreciation to AIR and Shoshana in particular for hosting these calls and giving us such tremendous support. I'm seeing lots of hearts and thumbs up. Everybody seems to agree. So with that, then we will close out this call. Thanks, everyone. Have a nice evening.